So, I was planning on making this video a couple of weeks ago, but then I had a cold, and I wasn't able to record it. By the time I got better, I figured nobody would care anymore. But then Warner Brothers did something I wasn't really expecting, and which makes this whole story infinitely more interesting than it was before. Warner Brothers released a trailer for the Snyder Trilogy. Now, if you're not familiar with the full context of this, Warner basically screwed over Zack Snyder in the course of the production and release of the 2017 film Justice League, which he was initially hired to direct as a sequel to his 2013 film Man of Steel and his 2016 film Batman v Superman. These films were initially planned to be the launch of a cinematic universe featuring the DC characters, and as such, they were not only judged as individual movies, but as springboards for future movies. Warner Bros. Pumped an insane amount of money into these three films. But after Batman v Superman underperformed at the box office and became the laughingstock of critics and Marvel fans everywhere, the executive team at Warner most definitely started to take a different look at Mr. Snyder and placed him under greater scrutiny. Now, while all big corporations have a high level of scrutiny directed towards their products at every single phase, you tend to be viewed less harshly as long as you're making money. Since Zack lost money on Batman v Superman, Warner executives were worried about the profitability of Justice League, and when he stepped away from the project, Warner used the opportunity to make significant changes to the product under the direction of Bryan Singer. Sorry, I meant Joss Whedon. Many people have taken to calling the theatrical release of this film Justice League, because ultimately, according to auteur theory, since Whedon finished the product, it is his film and not Snyder's. Snyder was not expected to return to the DC universe since essentially being laid off from his own film. He wasn't even expected to work with Warner Bros. Again and took his newest film to Netflix instead. So for a while there, it kind of looked like tensions were high between Zack and Warner. Now, things obviously look different. It appears that Snyder is now back in the good graces of Warner Bros., considering they gave him $70 million to complete a film that they had already spent somewhere around $300 million on. If you count the original film's budget towards the Snyder Cut, then we have a film which cost roughly $370 million, making it the second most expensive film ever made after Pirates of the Caribbean? Really? Why is this the most expensive movie ever made? That might have to be another video. Anyway, Mr. Bros, if that is his real name, decided to give Snyder quite the chunk of change to put his version of Justice League onto HBO Max. Now, this is already unusual as, from a PR perspective, it kind of looks like Warner has caved and given into fan demands. There is a militant portion of Zack Snyder's fan base which has been demanding his Snyder Cut even before the original film was released in theaters, but they never received what they asked for, until now. There must have been some kind of internal change at Warner that had facilitated this. It's really hard to do research on this stuff when you have no industry contacts and you live in Florida, but searching around LinkedIn and checking the Wayback Machine for the list of corporate executives at Warner, there seems to be a handful of hires and promotions within the executive team around 2017, presumably replacing certain people who held those positions previously. There's no way of knowing exactly who makes which decisions, but it seems obvious that there was enough of a change in leadership around 2017 that Zack's relationship to the company was reconsidered, and after teasing the Snyder Cut in late 2019, it was officially announced in 2020 and released in 2021. And now, post-release, Warner has taken an additional step and released a trailer for the Snyder Trilogy. No doubt spurred on by generally positive fan reactions to the Snyder Cut, it seems that Warner is actually subtly throwing Whedon under the bus by asserting that this version of Justice League is the true sequel to Batman v Superman, and the one released in theaters, helmed by Whedon, is some sort of alternate version that nobody cares about anymore, which is kind of weird when you consider that most people didn't like Batman v Superman, and it was really only the most hardcore fans of that film who were demanding the Snyder Cut to begin with. Now, I'm all for Whedon getting thrown under the bus. It seems like a long time coming, and most reports claim that Snyder is actually a pretty decent guy, even if half of his movies are super bad. But all of this has me thinking about what exactly it means for the future of films and film marketing. Lots of people have made videos already detailing their opinions of the new version, the differences between the theatrical and the Snyder Cut, why Snyder's version is better, etc., etc. But we're not going to talk about all that. I want to discuss whether or not it matters that it's better. Of course, my initial instinct is to say no. After all, it's just some really expensive reshoots and one or two extra scenes thrown in. Especially after DC has confirmed that their slate of films going forward afterward will not explicitly share continuity with this Snyder trilogy, this is pretty much just a glorified director's cut. Most director's cuts do change the story in significant ways and often provide alternate endings. It's a standard practice for the home release of many films going all the way back to the invention of home video. However, most director's cuts aren't the linchpin in a multi-billion-dollar cross-platform film franchise. Justice League is at the center of the second highest grossing film franchise of the last decade. Or maybe third. I'm too lazy to do the math. And let's talk about those other two for a second. You may have noticed a complete lack of director's cuts within those two franchises. Disney strives to make sure that the theatrical releases of their films are as close as possible to the DVD releases, meaning that they want the product to be finished and untouched, as opposed to something like a director's cut, which makes significant changes to what was seen in theaters. They try to keep the theatrical releases as close as possible to the home video releases. They haven't released any sort of director's cut for either of these two franchises. They also tend to be pretty strict about the canon between these films, and while they occasionally retcon something, they tend not to make significant changes. They treat the continuity between their films with such reverence that you're probably going to see Bugs Bunny joking about it in the new Space Jam movie. Disney loves continuity and hates director's cuts. In fact, the Mouse historically has never released director's cuts for any of their films. Occasionally you'll see the home release of a movie come with an extra scene or two, but you'll almost never see something with the title director's cut be distributed by the Mouse. Part of Disney's brand is the illusion of a unified company, with deliberate intentions in all aspects. When you buy a Disney product, they want you to believe that what you are buying is the exact, unadulterated, pure version. You can even see this in the way that they market their digitally altered versions of their classic animated films.
Now restored to its original brilliance.
Which is one of the few instances where they actually do make significant changes to their original products. But if we start talking about that, then I'm going to get really heated really fast, because why would you remove the texture of these films? They were already so good before, and now you made them look... So Disney prefers to keep up appearances and never admit to wrongdoing, and they're on top right now. And Warner Brothers comes second. And Warner doesn't have the same principles as Disney. They're willing to take more risks, and so risks they took. They let Zack Snyder take the lead on their attempt to compete with the MCU, which at the time was quickly on its way to becoming the highest grossing franchise of all time. And now, they've taken another risk in allowing my boy Zack to release the version of Justice League that they thought was too risky to release in the first place. In doing so, especially with such a positive reaction from fans and critics alike, Warner Brothers has essentially admitted that they were wrong. Of course, this is not the same exact team of people at Warner Brothers. As we discussed earlier, it seems that the decision-making power has changed hands. And while I do want to make a video about the strange way in which we personify and even anthropomorphize corporations, suffice it to say, I think it's a very humble look for Warner, and I wish the corporations would do that more often. Disney's constant maintaining of a can-do-no-wrong attitude is pretty scary, and it seriously inhibits their ability to own up to their prior mistakes. Again, we're talking about a corporation and not an individual or even a group of individuals, but you get my point. Speaking of points, I got off on a bit of a tangent there. Back to the topic at hand. What does this mean for the future of movies? While most director's cuts may alter the plot, Snyder's cut significantly changes the canon of the film. And although Warner currently holds the position that this will not affect the canon of the rest of the films released so far, we have to wonder if it will affect future releases. Canon is a funny thing because it's arguably what fans care about the most. While it's unlikely that the upcoming films in the DCEU will lean into Snyder's grim, dark, gritty tone, will the continuity of those films follow Whedon's cut or Snyder's cut? The films currently in production, like Black Adam and The Suicide Squad, are probably going to follow Whedon's cut, but perhaps the success of Snyder's cut will convince Warner to change course. Maybe Darkseid will follow up on what he was doing during Snyder's Justice League. Who knows? The DCU so far has really stopped caring whatsoever about continuity, which is great because not only do I not care about the canon of DC, but I think I'm generally pretty bored of continuity between films as a concept. The only thing I really care about carrying over between films is a character's emotional arc. which the MCU accomplished pretty masterfully with Tony Stark and pretty decently with Steve Rogers. DC can't even get a character to have an emotional arc within a single film, so I'm not really expecting an arc to cross multiple films. I mean, they can't even get the same actors to sign on for more than a couple movies. Apparently, Gal Gadot is the only actor interested in playing her character for the foreseeable future. And while that might be related to behind-the-scenes drama, Warner has decided to just not give a fuck. They're not even attempting the minimal amount of effort where they justify an actor's replacement or disappearance in the narrative of the films, like in a soap opera, where they say a character underwent facial reconstruction or a character had to leave but their vaguely similar-looking sibling showed up to take over the same role. Instead, Warner is essentially treating every film in the franchise as an independent thing. Obviously, there's a sort of trilogy going on with Man of Steel, Batman v Superman, and Justice League, but beyond that, their films are basically just pasta getting thrown against the wall to see what sticks. So why bring up the question of continuity at all if Warner Brothers themselves are likely to just ignore it? Well, I bring it up in this context because this is the first time something like this has been attempted, and I think it sets an interesting precedent for films going forward. The franchises are essentially like big, expensive television series. Justice League is just one big crossover episode, but what happens when you change the events of an episode that's already aired? During the age of prestige TV, it's hard to imagine something like this happening. Most shows now are produced a season at a time, with careful attention paid to the continuity between episodes. But could you imagine going back to season 1 of Breaking Bad and producing an alternate version of the episode where Walt kills Crazy 8? Like, what if you significantly change the plot of that episode? It's obvious to see the kind of impact that would have on subsequent episodes, but then, in this hypothetical scenario, you don't produce the subsequent episodes with the change accounted for. You just changed the one episode and left the remaining show untouched. That would be a pretty silly thing to do. It's not quite a one-to-one comparison. Obviously, a single episode of a serialized TV show isn't quite as much of a standalone product as a 2-hour action movie or 4-hour action movie, depending on which version you get. But regardless, what might happen going forward as a result of Snyder's Justice League being released to such approval? Might other commercial and/or critical failures be retooled and re-released a couple years later? And if the second release of a film doesn't do the numbers they want, what's to stop them from doing it a third time? Corporations, after all, only want your money. And if you're willing to pay multiple times, or at the very least pay the entry fee in the form of a monthly subscription, then what's to stop Warner from releasing multiple cuts of the same movie over and over again? Maybe next year we'll get Joss Whedon's Justice League, where he recuts the film and changes the plot and villain and all that. Even if you only watch it just to shit on it, Warner still gets your money at the end of the day. After all, it would be a lot cheaper for them to recut an old film than to produce a new one. We already know that Disney won't try it. Instead of sticking to their guns or releasing a changed version of The Last Jedi, they just decided to retcon everything from The Last Jedi in The Rise of Skywalker. This is Disney's way of maintaining their brand integrity, which is pretty dishonest when you think about it. But maybe Warner will inspire somebody else to try it. There's a decent chance the industry is headed in that direction, at least in some small ways. Maybe every movie doesn't get reworked, but some of the more disastrous failures have a chance to be redeemed if a studio puts enough money into recuts and reshoots and retakes. Maybe it even becomes standard practice for films to be retooled multiple times during their home video releases. Maybe even Disney gets in on it at some point. You never know. Now, this does have some interesting ethical and philosophical considerations related to the nature of art, and I hope to make a video about that soon. But for now, I'd just like to say, if the future I described sounds scary and you'd like to make sure film as a medium doesn't die off, consider donating to our Patreon. As I've mentioned a couple times, I'm working on a cartoon about the film industry. It's a lot of fun. There's a preview that you can watch on Patreon right now. And make sure you're supporting other cool creators on YouTube and other platforms, because I don't know about you, but I'd rather watch something made with care and passion by somebody online than watch a $200 million product produced by a greedy corporation. But that's just me.